We're going to wrap up Proteus now, and one thing I've learned since the last video was that I'll link in the video information to this neat article about the land where this chapter takes place, Sandymount Strand. I said before that I thought the strand looked a little different. It didn't seem as large as it's described in the book. And I thought, my reasoning being that it was the tide difference. And that may be a part of it, but actually a lot of the area where Stephen is walking, I have learned, it is no longer beach. It's been built over with buildings. So that explains a lot. Check out that article, it's neat, etc. The end. We can take a look now at the thoughts as Stephen's mind winds through this chapter. You're going to see that a lot of his thinking is sort of a call and response pattern to his environment. Things will come up in the environment like a dog or women, and he'll think of different things and they'll inspire his thoughts. This gives Joyce an opportunity to not only recount what has happened between A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses, but to give you some exposition about Stephen in general and wrap up his philosophy and his consciousness at this point in his life, which is similar to Joyce, but Joyce is, by the time he's writing Ulysses, in his 30s, Stephen is about 22, so there's going to be some significant differences. There's a great section in this chapter in which Stephen is considering going to visit his Aunt Sarah. We get this good amount of dialogue that seems to be happening as he does the visit, and then at the end of it you realize, oh, he didn't actually visit them, the family. It's all taking place in his imagination, and that's the kind of thing that Joyce is playing with here. This is Proteus. It's a very you try and hold on to what you think is happening, but there's always this slipperiness to it. A lot of his thoughts turn to Paris, his time there. Joyce went to Paris to study medicine. He didn't last very long. He couldn't keep up with his studies. His French wasn't good enough. Stephen's going to recall similar things, the struggle, the hunger. It just was a very difficult time for Joyce, and until he gets the telegram that recalls him back to Dublin. The telegram simply said, "Mother dying, come home, father." And those 5 words, or however many words, "Mother dying, come home, father." We also get these references to Kevin Egan, which is based on a Fenian character, or a Fenian person in real life, the group that was organizing against the British government. You can tell that Stephen was very blown away by Paris, how there were all these revolutionary figures, artistic figures, so much was happening. It was such a different world from Dublin. But the telegram would bring Stephen back to Dublin, out of that world, that bohemian metropolis, back to a smaller city, but still a city, and having to deal with his mother's death and the guilt of how she died and him refusing to pray for her. That's going to haunt him throughout the book. And we also learn a lot about his fears, his fear of dogs. I don't know if fear of thunder comes up, but that will come up later in the book. He has a lot of fear, a lot of guilt, and a lot of understanding that he's not a strong person in some ways. For example, Buck Mulligan saved people from drowning, apparently. And Stephen, he thinks about it and he's like, would I be able to dive in and save somebody? I don't know, I'm afraid, because I'm not a good swimmer. He's making all these excuses. And there's also this feeling that he's kind of like Prince Hamlet. He's just very indecisive, and he knows a lot, but he doesn't know how to act. We also get this dream that Stephen recalls briefly in this chapter, and it seems to hint at Stephen's meeting later on with Leopold Bloom. So maybe Stephen's sort of like a fortune teller. We'll look at that dream maybe, if I remember to come back to it later. We'll see. These images of the corpse floating in the water and Stephen's feelings and state of mind in the state of paralysis is really the end of, it's like the mind at the end of its tether reached the end of its course, the possibilities of what this type of thinking and mode of consciousness can do. And it's very powerful, but it has left Stephen like this, so he needs something to take him to a new level of consciousness, I guess you might say. And I think that's going to be Leopold Bloom, and that's why we get this sudden shift in consciousness in the next chapter. Totally different character, And when Stephen returns later on, how they meet and how their personalities interact is what we're going to see. But first, Joyce had to establish Stephen's personality. But this image of death also allows and contains the possibility of a rebirth. As we look at Stephen going forward, I'm going to leave you with one final quote from this chapter on page 50 in my edition. It goes, "God becomes man, becomes fish, becomes barnacle goose, becomes featherbed mountain." Despite all its etherealness and wild thoughts and rambling philosophy, this chapter ends with Stephen just picking his nose and sticking the booger on a pebble or something. Maybe it's a foreshadowing of Leopold Bloom, because this is a much earthier person, and we're going to see that in the next chapter.